of madness. Very exciting. I'm Mona Chalabi, a class of 2023 New America Fellow, and it is my pleasure to introduce Camille Kidia. Camille is a writer, physician, and anthropologist at Harvard Medical School and University of Zimbabwe, a Rhodes Scholar and 2023 New America ASU Future Security Fellow. Cam has worked on global mental health research, practice, and advocacy for the last decade. His writing has been published in New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet Psychiatry, the New York Times, Slate, Yale Review, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Born in Zimbabwe, Kidia lives between Harare and Washington, D.C. Cam, it's so great to be here with you. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Oh my gosh, what an honor and pleasure. It feels like just the other day that we were here in DC, which is where I am right now, celebrating your Pulitzer as a class and just like having the most wonderful time. And here we are again. It's just such an honor, Mona.
Yeah, and I'm so excited that this book that we discussed back then is out. It's funny, I was so excited about the book when we first met, and I think that the book has still managed to surpass all of my expectations of what I thought it would be. It is so rigorous. It has so much heart in it. So much of you is in this book. Like, it is just such an incredible feat. So I wanted to just start off by asking, how do you feel now that it's out? I mean, it's only been, what, a couple of weeks?
Yeah, pretty much 10 days
Yeah.
or so. I everyone told me how anticlimactic it was to have a book released, and I had that feeling on the day of, and I don't know what I was expecting exactly to walk out of our apartment and see paparazzi all over the place, like take my photograph. But it was pretty anticlimactic at first, and then very quickly I had to do some shifts in the hospital in Boston. So I've just spent about a week on night shifts taking care of patients, and at first, I was sort of frustrated that my book came out, and the first thing I had to do was go back to the hospital and work as a doctor because it felt so distracting. But
Mm,
I can't tell you how absolutely grounding it has been for me because it's reminded me why I wrote the book in the first place.
yeah.
So much of that human texture that comes from practicing medicine helps me to see the world in a really kind of way that exposes the end organ effects of oppressive systems on our patients. And I, it was very validating actually to work in the hospital shortly after putting this book out there because so many of the patient stories that I shared with you were universal. I took care of a patient just 2 nights ago who had schizophrenia and was in a florid state of psychosis and was faced by so many of the moral dilemmas that you'll read about in Empire of Madness. Like, when do we or do we take away people's autonomy when
Mm.
they make decisions about themselves? And who gets to decide whether or not someone can make a decision about themselves?
Mm. And importantly, how did they get to that point in their lives where they are, yeah, where they do present kind of in crisis in that way? It's one of the really powerful things about the book is that you spend so much time thinking about those root and structural causes of those things. But I want to go back for a minute and just talk about how this book came to be. How was it that you sold it? Yeah. And when did that happen as well?
So I can tell you a bit about the timeline.
Mhm.
I had been working for a long time on, queer people's mental health in Zimbabwe, where I am, somewhat engaged and involved with community members and consider myself a queer Zimbabwean. And queer Zimbabweans were telling me that they needed help with their mental health in some way. And so I thought the answer to that would be through my mental health research. And I started working on an NIMH grant to work on queer people's mental health in Zimbabwe. But over time, my mentors at Harvard were pushing me in directions that I could tell weren't going to serve the community. For example, they wanted interventions that were focused on sexual health and focused on HIV, whereas people in Zimbabwe were telling me all we want are spaces to gather. All we want are, um, parties and the things that people get to have in places where it is safe to be openly queer. And so I went back and told my mentors that, this grant wasn't something that I felt comfortable doing, and instead started to focus on writing about queer people's mental health. And I thought I would write a book about
Mm,
queer people's mental health in Zimbabwe, which is sort of, a very kind of mental health researcher, anthropologist way of approaching a problem. And as I read more and more queer theory and decolonial theory in the process, I realized that what I needed to do was not write a book about queer people's mental health, but a book about queering mental health itself and that
mm,
concept. And it was sort of, this iterative push and pull
mm.
that, scholar activists talk about when you're engaged with both politics and writing at the same time.
I mean, and you're practicing, right? Like, how many people turn down grant money because they feel like actually it's not the ethical thing to do? It's incredible. Um,
I,
yeah.
I didn't, I didn't turn down the grant. I didn't apply for the grant, but
Okay.
if I
But
had,
still, yeah.
yeah, if I had gotten the grant, I don't know what I would have done. And that's something that, in my field, a lot of folks in global health sort of think of getting a grant as an important first step to
Yeah.
making an inroad for other kinds of social and political change, because a grant can be a platform that you can use to do other things from. And I'm not opposed to that idea. But at that point in time, where my thinking was that this grant wasn't going to be sufficient. And a lot of this process of kind of getting to this book has been very iterative like that.
Mm,
My thoughts and ideas changed as these events happened to me, studying mental health, experiencing mental illness, caring for people with mental illness. And so as I changed and learned more about what I was working on, I realized that I needed to write about it. And as I wrote about it, I learned more about what I was working on. And I hope it doesn't stop there now that the book is out. I hope that this conversation is just another step in carrying on to talk about these things, because, these ideas can't possibly be static. They're dynamic and they're, evolving. And so this book is not meant to be an exact treatise or prescription for how to do things,
mm.
but rather a departure point, an exercise in the imagination. How can we rethink these things altogether?
It doesn't feel like a treatise, but it also does feel very authoritative and very comprehensive. And I really want to understand a little bit more about what your process was for writing it. I mean,
Mm.
you and I have already spoken about the appendix and the notes takes up that much, like it is so robust. Yeah. Can you talk about how you went about doing that?
Sure. I mean, I wrote the book. Well, firstly, I thought a lot about what the book was going to say and argue. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I outlined sort of a stepwise argument about how I would do that. First think about deconstructing mental illness from within the field of medicine, especially by looking at schizophrenia, which is this illness that we feel has to be biological. Even doctors feel like, well, schizophrenia, depression and anxiety, I can understand how those are social conditions, but schizophrenia, that's the real genetic condition.
Mm,
And so deconstructing that idea and showing folks exactly how schizophrenia is a social and political condition was an important first step. And then another important first step was giving people an exercise in the imagination. And that involved, research into thinking about other ways of doing and thinking about mental health that are more social and more structural. And so once I had that outlined, I decided to write the book in reverse because the third part is about prescription. And I wanted to know where I was going with everything. And so I
mm,
wrote the book from the last chapter to the first. And along the way, kind of wrote it thematically. Each chapter was sort of some of these big ideas. And then I looked at it all together and had a manuscript workshop with 12 amazing people, folks with mental illness, anthropologists, queer theorists, doctors, and asked them what they thought about this. And I listened to their feedback. A lot of it was, we like a lot of where the argument is going, but the content is sort of disjointed. So
mm.
what I then used was my own narrative of how, through my experiences as a doctor and with my mother, how I came to understand the things that I was talking about at the end of the book, and use that narrative as kind of the blueprint in which to disperse that argument that was very categorical before. And so you're not going to read this book and get the argument from, you know, chapter to chapter to chapter in a stepwise manner. Instead, you're going to get a story with the argument dispersed throughout the narrative in the hopes that if you make it through the story, by the end, you'll get the argument.
And it's incredibly effective because I also feel like as a reader, you're kind of building a relationship with you, the writer, in a much more profound way as you're building that argument. It's very, very effective. I'm curious, you were mentioning queer Zimbabweans earlier on, and I'm curious, were there any communities that you were particularly keeping in mind as you was writing this book?
Hmm. Trans people have been on my mind. Trans and intersex people in Zimbabwe have been on my mind for quite some time. And that's because, even with sort of Western human rights and LGBTQ rights ideas filtering, into the global South, a lot of that type of activism is focused on gay people's rights and men who have sex with men. And in part, the way that HIV and sexual health programs are set up, they tend to favor men who have sex with men. But left out of this group are gender non-conforming people and trans people who really have been coming to me from Zimbabwe and asking for help. And, I had this patient when I was in medical school who I was or treating is an interesting word, who I was taking care of in an LGBTQ clinic. And she was there as a trans woman coming for psychiatric approval for her top surgery.
Was this
And
Vanessa?
this is Vanessa,
Vanessa,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And, a very standard, bog standard thing for her to come there and for us to do an intake and then create some documentation that she could take forward to the committee that was going to decide if she could get her surgery or not. Um, but as I was caring for her and checking off boxes to make sure that she had gender dysphoria, I realized that what I was offering wasn't really care at all. It was, to break down those gatekeeping barriers and allow her to access the gender affirming care that she needed to stay well.
Mm,
And when I thought about trans people back in Zimbabwe and the kind of help they needed and whether psychiatry would help or not, I realized that psychiatry, at least in the American sense of the term, didn't have that same kind of social or political power that could help people in Zimbabwe. A diagnosis of gender dysphoria in a country where, being gay is essentially illegal isn't very helpful. And
yeah,
so we have to think outside of those systems and institutions that have been given to us because they don't always work the same way in different contexts.
yeah.
That's sort of the moment, where it occurred to me that becoming an American psychiatrist wasn't going to be as helpful for queer Zimbabweans.
Yeah. And at the same time, your role in that particular encounter to best serve her is to kind of work within the system
Right.
in that particular moment, right? And give her a diagnosis that is going to get her the care that she needs. So can you talk a little bit more about just, I mean, on that one particular note, you mentioned the DSM in that, and that's something that I didn't know about before I moved to the US. Can you talk about like, yeah, you talk a lot about diagnosis in the book, and can you talk about it in the context of Vanessa maybe, and
Hmm.
how fraught that can be? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, Medical anthropologists talk a lot about diagnosis because it's such an interesting phenomenon. We call it nosology, the way that we categorize patients' illness and their experience into these different buckets. And that can be a really helpful thing. As doctors, what it does is help us narrow down these complex stories that we hear into manageable categories that we can group and then think about how to intervene. And so, from a clinical perspective, diagnosis helps us very quickly take some cognitive shortcuts for a complex patient and get to the answer that's going to help them. If a patient comes to me and they're like, I was I had a fever this morning, and look at this bright red spot on my arm over here that has all this pus pouring out of it. I'm immediately like, well, seems like you might have cellulitis. And automatically, as a doctor, certain things are happening in my brain where I'm taking some cognitive shortcuts to get this patient what they need right away.
Mm,
Now, that's the case for something like cellulitis, but in mental illness, we in medicine don't really have a way of truly confirming a diagnosis of mental illness. There's no blood tests. We can't look at the number of white blood cells that someone has in the blood. There's no MRI or CT scan that's going to tell us if someone has depression or even schizophrenia. And so we really do rely entirely on our subjective understanding of a patient's experience to put them into these categories.
mm,
What's interesting, though, then about the categories is that they're not very good. A lot of people who have psychiatric illnesses have more than one. And part of the reason that's the case is because the categories just are not capacious enough to hold the amount of suffering that we have as human beings.
mm,
And so you'll see people with depression and substance use disorder, or PTSD and anxiety, or schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and that can be called schizoaffective disorder. And those overlapping ideas and categories end up having consequences for treatments because people get treatments for their depression and their schizophrenia at the same time. And we use the drugs that we have in psychiatry pretty much for all of the things. All the drugs can be used for most of the mental illnesses in the right context and in the right way, which tells us really that the drugs are not silver bullets going for a lesion, a diagnostic lesion in patients' brains, but rather they're chemicals that can help people to cope with the complicated symptoms that they're feeling that are largely determined from their external environment. And so diagnosis is a very complicated thing, and there's so many ways of thinking of it as a, identity giving, helpful category, but it can also be pathologizing and unhelpful to patients. And figuring out which way it's going to go is context dependent. And so we need to be asking patients whether or not these diagnoses are something that they actually want given to them.
I think that's really, really valuable. Is that language a tool for that person to use as they move forward and as they continue to navigate their system, or does it actually feel like a burden? You mentioned the impact of prescriptions. There's another patient that kind of comes to mind when you're describing that, somebody who you described as having like a kind of cocktail. I think it was David, who
Oh, is it Daniel?
Daniel, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hoarding disorder.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about him? Because I thought he's another beautiful example of the book of somebody whose diagnosis is, again, as you say, so context dependent that somebody else who might have had the exact same behavior but been in a different set of circumstances would not have received that same diagnosis.
Sure, yeah. This was a patient who I saw in medical school as part of the visiting doctors program at Mount Sinai, an incredible program that sends doctors out into patients' homes in New York City and cares for them in situ because there are many reasons that patients can't leave their homes. And taking healthcare to them was how medicine was practiced until very recently. Doctors got to saw the environments in which their patients fell ill, which helps us take better care of them. Knowing your patient's context helps us come up with solutions that are not just medical, but woven into their social and political fabric, as we all are. And I remember walking to Daniel's apartment and thinking, wow, this is a lot of stuff because he was a hoarder. And he had so many medications that had been prescribed for him for mental illnesses that he had racked up along the years. He had SSRIs for depression and anxiety, some atypical meds that he'd been taking for insomnia and sleeping. I think he was also on a benzodiazepine. But what happens often, and then he was on some meds to counteract the side effects of some of the psych meds.
Yeah.
For example, he had dry mouth from one of the psych meds. And so a psychiatrist prescribed him an anti-dry mouth medication for the psych med that he wanted to get. And I was looking through all of his medications, and I realized that the reason that he'd been falling a lot and, had low blood pressures in his home. The reason he'd been falling was that he was just taking so many medications. And this is something that happens a lot, especially in American medicine, because the system is so fragmented that doctors prescribe in their own silos without thinking across the systems of our body, our organ systems, about whether or not their meds might have effects elsewhere in the body. We call this the prescription cascade. But yeah, Daniel was a really, really poignant case because his the reason that he was on some of these meds was for hoarding disorder. And that wasn't something that until I came to the US, I thought of as a real disorder. I grew up in hyperinflationary Zimbabwe, where hoarding was something very natural for us. It was something that we did in order to survive because there was such a scarcity of food and general goods like fuel for our cars and generators and electricity. And so when the environment is one of, real scarcity, the question that I started to ask myself is, well, is hoarding disordered or is it
Mm.
something that is normal? And then if you think about, the ultra rich, and what they do in terms of hoarding practices, taking health and wealth away from the rest of the world and keeping it for a very, very small population, well, that's hoarding too. And that's kind of a more destructive hoarding on a public and social scale. Why isn't that called hoarding disorder? These were questions that came up to me as a medical student looking around this patient's apartment, looking at all these piles of People magazines and thinking to myself, well, it looks like my grandma's house.
I'm going to just briefly take a moment to remind the audience of two things. One is that if you have questions for Cam, you can submit them through the Q&A function to the right side of the Slido box, and we will answer them. We'll get to them as soon as we can. And then the other thing, which is even more important, is that copies of Empire of Madness are available through our book selling partner, Solid State Books. And you can find a link to buy the book on this page by just clicking buy the book. I think someone's putting a link somewhere that I can't see, but I trust that people, and if not, just take the time, find a way to buy the book. I just want to stay on Daniel just for one more second, because I really do think you've already pulled so much out of that one story. But one of the things that you haven't mentioned that really, really struck me when you was describing that encounter was something that you did at the end of your conversation with him, which is that you looked through his prescriptions, you suggested eliminating some of them. I don't know if you prescribed some more drugs, and then before you left you said, shall I get rid of these? Which I feel like is actually something that many other doctors might not necessarily take the time to do, is to dispose of what the patient doesn't necessarily need, but just felt like such a beautiful act of care. And it's interesting because you talk about these cognitive shortcuts that often are quite necessary, right? I'm guessing that when you're in ER, there's no, there isn't necessarily the time to be sitting down and having a 20-minute long conversation about the politics of a particular diagnosis. You just have to do what is going to get care the quickest. But something like that is a beautiful example of actually an intervention that's quite quick, but could potentially have a huge impact on a patient if it means they're not taking a medication that they shouldn't. Can you talk more about kind of the range of approaches that you talk about in the book? Because again, some of them require years and years of work to rethink how we're approaching mental health, and some of them are quite quick. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted there to be something for everyone at every kind of level of society, at the most individual level. I wanted folks to have something that they could take home and change in their own lives. And at the same time, I don't want to put all the responsibility on individuals, because social and structural changes that I'm asking for are the way that we're going to have effects that are large scale for a lot of people all at once. And then there's stuff in between, stuff that we could be doing that are kind of like moderate level reforms that could be done at the healthcare system level. For example, I think a lot about the workforce that we have for caring for people with mental illness. And at the moment, especially in the US, it's so limited to a very, very finite number of clinicians, like therapists, licensed social workers, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists. These are the main people who take care of mental illness. But as a primary care trained physician, as a hospitalist, I know that for so many of my patients, their mental illness and their chronic illness is inextricable. Why can't we all be providing mental health care as part and parcel of what we do in our jobs? And so, one of my major sort of prescriptions is to rethink that system that silos psychiatry away from the rest of the social and medical
Mm.
systems and thinks of it as like this very unique thing that can only be done by these blessed few folks who, frankly, can't cope with the deluge of mental illness that is knocking at their doors.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of it is about how we can question some of these narratives about what we've been given to us as the tools for tackling these things. And, a lot, when I think about that, I think a lot also about your book and the work that you're doing about income and thinking about money and the ideas that we have been given to us, like hoarding. Um,
Mm.
and I'm wondering what you feel like our role is in doing this kind of work, in challenging the stories that have been given to us by people in power and saying, well, that's one way of looking at these things. Here's another way.
Yeah, I definitely feel like our books are in dialogue with one another. I think it's part of the reason that we really, really got along well when we met at that fellows event. I think both of us are reflecting, trying to like render visible a lot of systems that seem opaque or impossible to understand or immovable. I thought about my book a lot while I was reading your. There was a chapter on here that I think is called "Debt as Disease," where we meet. Is it Sheila?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of my book is also questioning this idea that people who don't have money it's partly because they're not good with money, which I actually think people with the least money are the best at it. They are so excellent at managing their resources because they have to
Mm.
be. But do you want to talk a little bit more about Sheila, because I loved meeting her. Yeah.
Sure. She was a patient also in medical school.
Mm.
Who
I didn't know that she was. Oh no, well, you were in medical
I
school.
was
She
I was
wasn't. Okay,
medical
yes,
school,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So I was, a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed medical student on a medicine service, and she was admitted for something routine, I think a colonoscopy, and she had some chest pain, which that happens sometimes. People have chest pain in the hospital. It's usually GERD. But because we are good doctors, we try and make sure we've covered everything and we want to rule out a heart attack. And so we started the process of ruling out a heart attack for Sheila, and then she disappeared. And eventually, when we found her in the hospital lobby a few hours later, she told us the story about the last time that she got an EKG, which is that kind of picture of the heart that we take with the leads to look for a heart attack. And she said that the last time she had one of those, she went into debt because she had presented to an emergency department. She had gotten an EKG. She had been ruled out for a heart attack. And when she got home, a few weeks later, she got this bill for thousands of dollars. And that debt has basically driven her into such a precarious space where she's working three jobs, taking care of two children as a single mother in New York City. And the weight of that debt on her mind was
Mm.
so, so strong that she was prepared to leave a hospital in the middle of possibly having a heart attack. And that has to tell you something about the psychological burden of some of these structural things. They can force you into what anyone would probably say is an irrational decision for your own health. But when you put it in context, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Totally. And I mean, implied in that as well is the possibility that I think is very, very plausible that her heart is under pressure because of this debt itself.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I actually hadn't even thought about that added layer to it. And you're absolutely right.
I know a member of my family who, without a doubt, they developed heart problems after developing economic problems, and there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that those two things are related.
Absolutely.
Um, Yeah, I want to talk a little bit talking about money and mental health. COVID
Mm.
is obviously something that affected both of those things for many, many, many people in this country and elsewhere. I'm curious how COVID affected the trajectory of the book and also some of your thinking that is in the book as well.
I mean, that's a great question that I have not really thought about explicitly, but implicitly through the book, which I was writing at the moment that the pandemic hit, really did shape the way I thought a lot about a lot of things. Firstly, in my own life and career, COVID forced me to stop doing what I was doing, and think about what I was doing. It really made me interrogate why I was doing what I was in the system. Um, but secondly, it exposed so many of the fractures in our social and political system, that leave the marginalized exposed and at risk. One of the main ways that we saw that in the hospital was just this deluge of patients from marginalized backgrounds, Black people, Hispanic people, who had rates of COVID and COVID mortality far greater than the rest of the population. And that was because those folks were forced to live in tighter quarters. They were forced to take on the types of roles that put them at risk, for example, as food delivery people or working in stores that were not allowed to close essential services, while we could sit in our apartments with all of the doors and windows shut and protect ourselves. And so, that mortality gap, that large increase in mortality in those populations during COVID really exposed that. But what I also learned was about the possible solutions for issues like this.
Mhm.
In 2021, President Trump issued, these stimulus checks for a certain percentage of Americans who fell below a threshold, and I was one of those people who got a stimulus check, for several $1,000s. The effect of that stimulus check on people's mental health was profound. It, you know, that together with the child tax credit in that year reduced child poverty, I think, by half. And on top of that, people had really, really improved mental health. And the folks who had better mental health were Black people, and white men actually had way, way better mental health after these stimulus checks, not because the money had given them access to more mental health services. So utilization of mental health services did not go up, but people just got this money and their mental health got better by itself, which means the lack of money, otherwise known as poverty, was the cause of the mental distress in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. It's to go back to what you were saying about these communities of color that had higher mortality rates. As you
Mm.
say, it's about like these close living quarters, these vulnerable jobs, and it's also about all of these underlying health conditions that are more prevalent in communities of color because of, again, structural factors that like poverty that mean you have less access to nutritious food. You're more likely to be affected by asthma because you're more likely to live in areas that have pollution.
Mhm.
Again, the book teases out all of these things in ways that I think, I just want to say, are so valuable, because what I get worried about in my work, because so much of my work is about visualizing disparities, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm simply showing, men are 5 times more likely to take their own lives, or trans people are 7 times more. I'm making up these statistics, but we do know that these are the communities that are much more at risk. Trans
Mhm.
people are much, much more vulnerable to suicide than cis people. And talking about communities of color, it can almost slip into something that can feel quite eugenicsy, right? If you're talking about how just Black people are more likely to die from COVID, if people aren't sufficiently well informed, they might just think that this disease latches onto Black bodies in a different kind of way. And
Right.
so, can you talk a little bit about how your work is kind of countering that risk of eugenicsy discourse, which I'm seeing more and more, by the way, like people's passion for 23andMe and
Yeah.
this feeling that they can understand their genetic code and somehow equip themselves to understand their health better is quite dangerous in a way.
Right. Absolutely. And I think this, in medicine, this is a fallacy that's produced by epidemiology, because it gives the idea that these groups, these categories that we give people, race, gender, sexuality, as
Are
if those are
fixed as if they're
biologic.
totally,
Exactly, as if
yeah,
they're biological, organic categories, but they're not race, gender, sexuality. These are socially constructed categories that have no bearing on people's biology. The increased risk that we see in these groups does not come from something organic or inherent to their biology. It comes from the external world and how oppressive
Mm,
it is on these people.
mm. I mean, can we talk briefly then about another book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is something that
Sure.
we had talked about when we met, and I think in some ways, I mean, I know it's a book that's helped a lot of people. It has raised really, really interesting ideas, and it's also furthered this idea of there almost being something molecular in different communities, which again is quite frightening if you continue that on to its kind of logical conclusion.
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with The Body Keeps the Score for lots of reasons. In part because it was the first book to open my eyes to some of these things,
Yeah.
because it takes this idea that our social and political environment do have some kind of effect on our biology and our thinking and our mental health. And then it gives a great biological scientific explanation for that through the idea of epigenetics, which is this idea that genes can be turned on or off by stresses in our environment. And it's a very, very appealing hypothesis for folks who come from a biological orientation, as I was, as a doctor. And so, in so many ways, The Body Keeps the Score helped me to start to see mental health and see trauma in a way that I hadn't been before. And at the same time, there's so much missing. And,
Yeah.
so I think it's important that we be able to make that connection between the social and the biological. But we have to realize that, firstly, that is not the only mechanism by which people are affected by their social and political structure. It isn't just that a gene is being turned on and off. It is the direct effect sometimes of these social political repercussions throughout people's lives in their ability to access healthcare or food or transport or not. Those are ways that directly affect people's health that have nothing to do with whether a gene is turned on or off by epigenetics. So it's deficient in that realm, but it's also deficient in the realm of thinking about mental health on a global scale. Trauma and this idea that, bad things happen and then have some effect on our mental health that can get passed on for generations is an interesting and important idea, but it's not as universal as we would think. It's quite a Western and American trope for understanding where mental distress comes from and therefore what to do about it. And as I was, running a peer support group for physicians in Zimbabwe during the COVID pandemic, I thought to myself, a trauma workshop is going to be the best way of helping folks cope with all this like massive trauma that we're experiencing. And boy, was I humbled when I ran a workshop for people in my own country because I thought I was helping them. And everyone on Zoom dropped off. And by the end, I was sitting there looking at two blank circles, two blank boxes, and I realized I was talking to zero people because everyone had logged off. And I was like, wow, this really didn't work. And when I asked for feedback from the Zimbabweans who were there, they told me that this idea of trauma is not as
Mm,
transferable. Zimbabweans feel like they have been experiencing trauma since the beginning of their country, from colonialism to malaria to HIV to political violence to, Operation Murambatsvina, which was this terrible kind of piece of political violence that Mugabe and his government inflicted upon the people of Zimbabwe in 2005. All of these things to them feel like a chronic trauma dumpster fire.
yeah.
And so for us to try and single out this one trauma of COVID, which in Zimbabwe had a death rate nothing like the HIV death rate or like the cholera death rate.
Mm,
And so, comparing them, most Zimbabweans were like, well, this isn't that bad. And that is something that I had to reckon with because here I was, my American training, which I thought was this perfect kind of encapsulation of how to address mental health problems. And it was existentially unmooring for me to have the tools that I had been given and trained to provide fall apart.
Mm, mm. And it's also beautiful, Cam, that you are able to draw from other epistemologies than simply like the West or the global North. I mean, this concept of Ubuntu, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it runs through the whole book from start to finish and comes up again and again. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what that means and how it guided your reflections in the book.
Well, Ubuntu is a concept from African philosophy that's frankly very difficult to translate into English. And that's
Mm,
why I felt like I needed to bring it up again and again in the book. And it's why sometimes when you read my writing about Ubuntu, it feels blunt. It feels like there are passages that I felt like I had to write in order to give my best sense of what this concept means. Directly translated, it means I am because we are. And it's this idea that our well-being is something collective. And so, we can think of that in our terms as our mental health is something collective, and that it's something relational that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so, if we really want to think about how to tackle mental health problems as a whole, we need to realize that we are all mental health care providers. What we do for each other on a day-to-day basis as friends, parents, family members, whether you're a bartender or a sex worker or a clinical psychologist or a teacher, what you are doing in your social worlds for the people around you needs to count as a form of mental health care. What you are doing for me, Mona, showing up for this book talk and having this gorgeous conversation is a form of mental health care for me. And I hope for you too, because there's something
yeah,
dialectical to this
yeah.
type of thing that is so intangible and difficult to put your fingers on, that for some African writers, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, they decided that they had to stop writing in English because English simply could not convey this
Mm,
concept of Ubuntu adequately. And so
yeah.
we come up to the limits of language and epistemology as well. In this book and throughout my work, that was something that I felt a lot, was just the limits of it all.
The concept of I am because we are, and I'm sure, as you say, it's not the best translation of it, is so powerful and beautiful, I think, not just for thinking about the solutions, which again, the book is so beautiful, and not just focusing on the issues, but on focusing on the solutions. But I also think about it in the context of mental health challenges that people face. And I think about actually how mental health can sometimes feel almost contagious, right? If you are living with somebody who is going through a mental health crisis, it feels very counterintuitive that it can be contagious. But I have certainly felt that before. Yeah. And you talk about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, mental illnesses can be contagious. There's so much data about how eating disorders spread in communities and across social media and across the world as well. There is so much about this idea called vicarious trauma, where people feel like they've been traumatized simply by hearing about other people's trauma.
Mm,
And then there's these instances of mass psychogenic illness that some people talk about. And in so many ways, if that is the admixture from where our mental well-being is coming from, it behooves us to try
yes.
and make that admixture of sociality as, I don't want to use the word positive because I feel like that's too normative, but to make the admixture of our social lives as caring as possible,
Mm, mm,
so that but for precisely the reason that you say, so that if we're going to be spreading anything and making anything contagious, let it be love and care.
yeah. Yeah. Well, we're talking about love and care. There's a lot in the book. The writing itself expresses so much of your love and care, but you also talk about yourself a lot in the book, Cam, and I've almost feel like a duty of love and care to manage that conversation as delicately as possible. Can you talk a bit, if you feel comfortable, about your mental health while writing it? Because writing a book is hard at the best of times, but you was also navigating a lot while you were doing it.
Yes, it was not easy to write a book about
Yeah.
mental health. While I experienced my own mental health challenges,
Mm,
and I did not write directly about some of those challenges because I felt like they were too close to, I was too proximate to them, and I wasn't able to give enough time to reflect on them. Yet they influenced the way that I thought about the ideas and problems and issues that I was dealing with in ways that are inextricable from the text.
Mm,
In discussing my mother's mental health, I was completely wrapped up and continue to be completely wrapped up in the health and mental health of my family and my friends because when they're not well, I don't feel well.
yeah.
And that is something that I realized is a sort of universal thing. It's very hard to feel good when those around you, those who you love, are suffering. And so there were moments over the years that I wrote this book that I myself was suffering. And I took time during those moments to really stop and reflect. And I asked for two extensions while I was writing this book. This book is, you know, a couple of years late, in part because I had to do some work on myself in order to be able to give you the product that you have today.
Well, it worked. Whatever you did, Cam, the final product is absolutely beautiful. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions from everyone else. So please don't forget that you can keep on adding them in. First of all, this isn't actually a question, it's just a comment of someone just saying that they love this concept of queering mental health. I completely agree. I think it's really, really effective. A question that we have here is, how do you navigate the tension between critiquing the system of antipsychotic use and working as a doctor in the US who probably needs to prescribe medication? I think we can remove probably. You do on a regular basis, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I literally prescribed antipsychotics for a patient last night because I was forced into another one of those structural, moral, ethical
Mm,
dilemmas that the corporatization of healthcare has led us to. That the overlap between capitalism and healthcare in the US is so strong that the system is designed in a way that even if you know that what you are doing can cause individual harm, you are forced into situations where the right legal institutional thing to do is to carry on prescribing antipsychotics. And so one of the ways that I navigate that tension is to actually think through it and reflect on it and write about it and figure out
mm,
where my positionality is in all of it. In the heat of the moment, while I'm practicing medicine, sometimes I have no choice and I have to be able to care for the patient and the people around the patient at the time that I'm caring for them. That is the best I can do in the system that I've been given. But part of how I navigate it is figuring out what are ways that we can go forward to make changes that will lessen that harm, that will reduce this type of intervention. And so, I am calling for, from the medical field, us to really interrogate taking away patient autonomy. It's something that I want to really force us to think much harder about. And the way that I want to do that is by thinking about medicine on a global scale and giving comparative examples from other parts of the world where restraints and antipsychotics are used far less and where patient outcomes are often a lot better.
yeah. I love that the book is also your contribution to that, as you say, that you can give the prescription in that moment and then go away and hope that your writing will contribute to a shift. I really want to get through some more of these questions because they're really, really good ones. Another question from somebody who's anonymous. Presumably you cannot solve your patient's finances or their experiences of racism or homophobia. So how do you address your schizophrenic patient's suffering?
Hmm. So I mean, that's a great question, and I think it has a couple of ways that we can go. I think one of the first things that you can do for patients as a doctor is to listen to their story about what is going on in their lives and take it seriously. Take it very, very seriously. If a Black man with schizophrenia is telling you that he feels like he's being surveilled by the government or by the FBI, take that paranoia very seriously
Mm,
in context. Because look at the world that we're living in today. That does not seem that irrational of a thought in the world that we're living in today. So, helping take your patient's stories seriously and validating what their experience is a first important step. It is not going to solve their problem, but at least it is not gaslighting them into thinking that the source of their distress is something entirely up here.
Yes.
So that's one thing. And, the other thing is, I do think that we can, as doctors, advocate for our patients far more to help them solve their financial and their, other structural problems. I just think we lack the imagination to do it. There's this idea called social prescribing. It's taught in every medical school in the UK. And it's this concept of giving people social prescriptions that help with the structural things in their lives. It could be a dance class or a walk in the
Mhm.
woods, or it could be pure cash or housing or food. These are things that in some systems, doctors have found ways of actually prescribing for their patients. And in my primary care practice as a resident, there were things that I could do to connect people with disability, to connect people with housing, and not thinking of those things as this extraneous idea that is dealt with by the social workers, if at all, but rather as an integral part of our medical practice is one way that we can change the way that doctors and medical providers are thinking about some of the structural things. I think an important message that I have for everyone is we feel as if things have always been this way, that
Yes. Yeah.
things cannot change, that capitalism has been as cutthroat as it is right now, that psychiatry has been as violent as it is at the moment. But the truth is that things haven't been like this for very long at all. If you look at it in the grand scheme of history, they were different not so long ago. And the other thing is that they're going to change again.
Yeah.
I want to be part of that change.
That's beautiful, Cam. Um, I'm torn between going back to the questions and just agreeing with you so wholeheartedly that I think that the way that capitalism is thought of in the US is almost as if these are physical laws like gravity about what the
Yeah.
market does, and that they are totally immovable. And I think again, part of what your book is doing is challenging this idea of what constitutes the natural and what is in fact entirely man-made.
Now, the
Um,
philosopher Mark Fisher has this idea that basically sums it up called capitalist realism. Uh,
mm,
it's this like this feeling, this fixity of how capitalism could never possibly be undone, so why bother trying?
mm,
But he shows us how historically and how reimagining a different future is an important step to undoing that capitalist realism. Our thinking and our imaginations are going to give us the way forward.
yeah. I mean, just on imagination, it's so interesting because I think of capitalism as being a system under which a lot of people spend a lot of time dreaming. Like a lot of people spend much time thinking about their ascent, this
Mm.
by your bootstraps kind of fantasy that you can make it somehow, even if you're born into poverty. And actually, what's kind of counterintuitive is, as you say, capitalism actually really, really limits our imagination and it limits our ability to kind of think more creatively. Anyway, I want to squeeze in a few more questions in the time we have. What do you think the most important areas of future research are for the field of global mental health, transcultural psychiatry, and where should the focus be?
Oh, that's a great question.
That is a good
I
question.
have so many thoughts about it. I could talk about that for a full hour.
Sure.
I think the future of global mental health and transcultural psychiatry is in patient movements and the lived experiences of people who are experiencing mental distress themselves. I really see this movement of folks who are advocating for themselves and their mental health, and telling us the ways in which the system is not serving them and giving us ideas and thoughts for how to think about that outside of the box. And so I'll mention a couple of them. One is the way we measure mental health. So, I think that the way that we ask people about mental health problems is completely um, categorical and in these boxes that we create for people and then give to them. But another way we could be thinking about research and how to measure mental health is for patients themselves to come up with their own measurements and ideas for what works for them. So you could ask someone to rate their own distress and help to create their own scale of what success would look like if they were to recover from their distress or if they were to get better. And then instead of rating their improvement based on a scale that we have created for them, we're rating it on their own way of perceiving their success. And I think that it's called, patient-led outcomes or patient-reported outcomes. And that kind of new way of measuring and thinking about mental health is one thing that I'm interested in. But another way that I'm thinking about involving people in their care is to really break down the hierarchy between patients and doctors. I have this kind of pipe dream of an idea to start a patient group, a patient health group for queer people in Zimbabwe, where folks all participate as members of the groups, whether you're a healthcare provider or a queer person. Everyone is queer, and we help each other to navigate mental and physical health problems, including sexual health, HIV, gender affirming care. If I were in that group, I would be showing up and we would be having group discussions about all of our social problems and all of the medical problems that we would be having. And my role as the prescriber, as the physician, would only be to make sure that I can reduce the gatekeeping barriers that systems put up by writing everyone's prescriptions. Other than that, everyone is considered on the same sort of level. And this idea comes from this patient collective called SBK from the 1970s, which I read about in an amazing book called Health Communism. And, in this 1970s sort of group of patients who were advocating for their own mental illness, they got together with the doctor on a frequent basis and protested the very conditions that were causing them to fall mentally ill. I want us to be able to see patients protesting their structures that are harming their mental health as a form of mental health care.
Mm. It's so disruptive to the power balance between doctors and patients, this idea of the group where you are both a member of it and able to give prescriptions. It feels very, very radical. Okay, two more questions, Cam. I'm going to start with one that I think is quite fun. Do you watch The Pit? And if so, what do you make of it?
So I have watched a few episodes of The Pit,
Yeah.
and it is just too close to home for me. It is
Uh,
so the feelings that I have while I watch that show of like sort of welling anxiety and constant like struggle of working within a system that is causing my patients to fall ill is so strong that I actually can't watch it very much. So I do watch it. I think it's, pretty accurate on an emotional tenor level.
okay.
But that emotional tenor is sort of too strong for me to carry on watching. Good show, though.
Okay, good to know that it's like sort of accurate though, at
It's
least
sort of
emotionally
accurate.
accurate. Yeah. And then the very last question, which I think is a beautiful one for us to end on. If there's one thing that you hope that readers will take away from this incredible book, what would it be?
I think it's coming back to that centralizing idea of Ubuntu. I am because we are the focus on the collective and the idea that our mental health is not created in a vacuum, but rather in relation to everyone around us. And so what that means, as I said before, is that we are all mental health care providers. Go home and remember that what you do in your social worlds, whether that's picking up the phone and calling your grandmother, or being more neighborly, or voting in your local elections, or going to a protest, or organizing a protest, what we do in the social and political admixture around us really does count because we are all mental health care providers.
I love that. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Cam. Also, I just want to remind everyone to buy the book. Buy the book. I don't know where this link exists that everyone can click on, but even if you can't click on the link, buy Empire of Madness. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, Cam.
All the pleasure.